topics. We'll discuss the Innovator's Dilemma, hosted by Terry Thiel. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about SLA and the competitive intelligence community. As most of you may know, the 2020 SLA annual conference in Charlotte has been pushed back, like every other event in your life, to October 15th through the 18th. So be sure to mark your calendars and make note of that change. Also, CID course registration, continuing education, is now open for the following courses: Intel 14, Identifying and Managing Biases in Research, Analytics, and Decision Making. Also, Intel 8, Competitive Intelligence Analysis Fundamentals. For new people out there, you probably want to take the second course first and then go back in time and take the first course. This is an ongoing series, which is sponsored by Aurora WDC. Stay tuned for an announcement of the topic and presenter and host for our May Competitive Intelligence Community webinar, which is forthcoming. With that, I'd like to talk a little bit about these conferences. Attendees are giving us rave reviews. Last month, we had a talk with Dolly Goulet from who talked a little bit about how to fostering an open data culture in organizations. And our lucky webinar winner, we give out $25 to one lucky attendee, said that despite different work environments, it was reassuring to hear that the path to success lies in identifying client pain points, which I think is something we can all work with right now in this interesting time frame. And I'm sure your clients' pain points are a moving target at the moment. But just wanted to remind everybody that we will be giving out a $25 gift card to one lucky attendee today out of everybody who has signed up. And finally, would like to mention that you are welcome to tweet CIC webinar during this presentation. Spread the love, get the word out, and communicate as best as possible. Shine a little light on the organization right now. We would all appreciate that. Now, let me introduce the topic. So Terry Thiel will be talking about the Innovator's Dilemma, which is a book by Clayton Christensen. When I was asked if I would be moderator for this webinar, I jumped at it because back in 2014, I was given a book by Clayton Christensen, How You Measure Your Life. And it was at a time where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I've been with the same company for about 21 years and was looking to make a move, and the book helped cement my decision, and I haven't looked back since. So I'm a fan of Clayton Christensen's writing, and I'm also a fan of Terry Thiel. So I've known Terry for a couple of years through CI conferences and symposia. He's a great speaker. He brings a wealth of knowledge, and I'll just run through some edited highlights of his background here. He's a principal at TV Thiel Limited. He brings 40 years of experience in helping businesses with strategic planning, government relations, and issues of advocacy. From 2000 to 2018, he worked for Lubrizol Corporation, and before that, he's worked in national, state, government relations, and environmental policy functions. He spent time with Electrolux AB, General Electric Corporation. He's also a professor, adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve University. He's taught graduate level courses in strategic planning, which means all of you are basically getting college credit for this webinar today. He's taught courses on disruptive innovation, which is what we'll be covering today. He's a graduate of Princeton University, got his JD from New York University School of Law. He's also a graduate of the National War College. He's also spent 15 years in the Army Reserve, honorably discharged with the rank of captain. And I have it on good intelligence that nobody in the CI community has ever seen him without a bow tie and lived to tell about it. So with that, I will go ahead and toss it over to Terry, and everybody prepare to have your mind blown.
Thank you, Phil. I guess the first thing I'd like to do is just exactly explain what the Innovator's Dilemma is, as Clayton Christensen described it. And I'm going to quote him verbatim here. He said, "The reason for why great companies failed is that good management itself was the root cause. Managers played the game the way it's supposed to be played. The very decision-making and resource allocation processes that are key to the success of established companies are the very processes that reject disruptive technologies. Listening to customers, tracking competitors' actions carefully, and investing resources to design and build higher performance, higher quality products that will yield greater profit. These are the reasons why great firms stumbled or failed when confronted with disruptive technology change. Successful companies want their resources to be focused on activities that address customers' needs, that promise higher profits, that are technologically feasible, and that help them play in substantial markets. Yet to expect the processes that accomplish these things also to do something like nurturing disruptive technologies, to focus resources on proposals that customers reject, that offer lower profit, that underperform existing technologies, can only be sold in insignificant markets, is akin to flapping one's arms with wings strapped to them in an attempt to fly. Such expectations involve fighting some fundamental tendencies along the way that successful organizations work and about how their performance is evaluated. So that's how Christensen describes the inventor's dilemma. I'm not going to spend a dramatic amount of time talking about Christensen because I think things have moved on from when he wrote that book in 1997. In fact, I'd note at the beginning that prior to Christensen's book in 97, Adrian Slawotsky in 95 wrote about value chains and the curve, your value curve. So I think in some respects, Christian was building on Slawotsky's work. This is not particularly new. But when you think about innovation, I think we need to parse it a bit. I'd argue that there are really three gradations of innovation, and there are no bright lines between them. There's a bit of a slurring. It's a continuum, if you think. But clearly, every company all the time is engaged in evolutionary innovation. And this is incremental change over time of improving your product. When I first got to GE appliances, they had just gone from piston to rotary compressors, which was internal workings to the refrigerator that were more efficient. They were supposed to be more efficient. There's a whole story about GE's rotary compressors, but we'll set that aside for another day. But the point is that was an example of evolutionary innovation. An example of revolutionary innovation was about 1995. The Department of Energy was promulgating an energy efficiency standard for clothes washers. At the time, Whirlpool had about 50% or thereabouts market share in top loader clothes washers. Those of you who are old enough to remember back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 99% of all clothes washers were top loaders. At the time of the rulemaking, I was working for AB Electrolux, which was Frigidaire in North America, and Frigidaire had nothing going for it, 14% market share, and we were going in the wrong direction. So what do? Are we in a position where we can try to augment that technology and beat out Whirlpool when it has such a dominant position, both in manufacturing and in design? Well, the answer for Electrolux was what Frigidaire had that Whirlpool didn't necessarily have were European clothes washer designs. Electrolux in Europe was the leader in front load clothes washers, which is what dominated the European marketplace at the time. So what Frigidaire did is, in the context of the rulemaking, they said that we can afford, we're economically viable to make a transformational change in the manufacturing and design of clothes washers from front loaders to top loaders. And as a result of that, DOE set an energy standard that front loaders could meet, but that top loaders could not. And overnight, we obsolesced 50%, that 50% market share because we had taken Whirlpool's manufacturing base and obsolesced it with the rulemaking. So that's an example of a revolutionary innovation. Disruptive innovation is where you basically change the name of the game. and you've come with an entirely different value proposition to meet a customer need in a way that maybe the customer hadn't previously thought about. Now, I'd like to stress revolutionary and disruptive innovation is not necessarily new. I'm going to show you a slide here. Many of you may have seen these pictures before. It's one of my favorite slides. This is New York City, Park Avenue. I believe it was the Easter Parade in 1900 and 1913. And the question for you is, what's different in the two pictures? And without holding you in suspense, in 1900, there was one automobile. And in 1913, there was one car, or there was one horse, I should say. Actually, while I was staring at this before, I discovered that there's a second horse. But the point remains that there was a dramatic change in the transportation sector at the turn of the century that happened literally overnight. And going back to Christensen's Innovator, how would one have factored that in if you were in the horse and buggy industry at that time? What was the driver that forced the transportation sector out of horses and buggies? Well, this is where I think things we need to take a different spin on this, because the answer is probably not what you think. The answer is really manure. If you look up the great 1894 manure crisis, you will see that London, Paris, and New York were drowning in manure and also dead horses. And there was no end in sight. In fact, they had a conference scheduled in 1894, representatives from the three cities, to try to figure out what to do about it, and they couldn't come up with an answer. The point is that a revolutionary innovation, I wouldn't say necessarily disruptive, but a revolutionary innovation appeared out of the blue that addressed needs that people hadn't necessarily tied back to transportation. That's the challenge with innovation. Now, what is new? Well, what is new is that Fortune 500 companies are dying at a faster rate. This is also true for all publicly traded companies. And that begs the question, why is this so? I would argue that there are a range of societal and technological changes that are all occurring now and that are going to fundamentally transform how you go to market and how you mass produce, how you produce in the very near future. When you think about societal change in terms of urbanization, demographics, deflation, deglobalization, and changing consumer and employee behavior. These are all fundamental shifts that are all happening at the same time. When you think about technology, think about cheap, ubiquitous, off-grid energy. Think about 3D printing, nanotechnology, automation. Think about the range of entirely new materials that are coming online. The Internet of Things, big data and analytics and artificial intelligence, and how they transform our ability to look at data. Overall, the digital factory, blockchain, synthetic biology. I've rattled off a whole series of different changes. The point being is that they're all happening at the same time. So what does that lead us to? Well, I would argue that we have gone from a world of global mass production, and we are rapidly approaching a world of local customized production. Why is this so? Well, when you think historically, mass production, unit cost versus volume produced, there was this microeconomic iron law about where you made your money, and it was on the high volume, low cost product. That was the 80-20 rule for your SKUs. You made 80% of your money on 20% of your SKUs. What's changing is the introduction of mass customized products. And what they do is they make that iron law go away. And your 80-20 rule has now become the 100-100 rule, where you can make product on every unit you sell because you make the units as you need them and you customize them to the customer. This is a fundamentally different world. Going back to one of them in particular, I mentioned 3D printing. What 3D printing enables is not only an entirely different approach to production, but an entirely fundamentally different approach to design. Historically, when you manufactured anything, you took a block of something, like a block of steel, and you took stuff away to get at the product embedded in it. With 3D printing, you're not designing from the outside in. You have flipped it on its head and you are designing from the inside out. Fundamentally different approach to design that will not only change what you produce, but how it performs in ways that previously arguably were impossible. If I can leave you with one phrase to think about the future, it's the Chris Anderson quote from when he introduced the long tail. Up until now, the focus has been on dozens of markets of millions instead of millions of markets of dozens. That's the world we're going into. Now, let's talk about the innovator's dilemma in the context of this brave new world. And I would argue that the primary role, the primary goal of a CEO today is to be driving constant innovation. When you think about innovation historically, you always started from a safe place where you were making known product for known markets, and then depending upon the company and the CEO and the culture, you decided how far out you wanted to, dip your toe, if you will, into revolutionary and disruptive markets and opportunities. This is the old 4-blocker, and you've got that scary white space out there in the corner. But up until now, this was something that you could choose to do. The point I'm trying to make about the future is that that's no longer the case. You don't have the choice. The competition is coming at you. Disruption is going to occur for one of myriad different reasons. You can't hunker down in that safe space anymore. So it begs the question, well, who is going to be willing to do this? Because what you're really asking the CEO to do is you're asking the CEO to obsolesce her or his company before the competition does. And that begs the question, well, who does that today? And I would argue the only companies that I know of that have been willing to obsolesce themselves are those that are desperate, that are already on the road to obsolescence, and they're willing to try anything. Why does it fail? Well, first of all, I think we've got to realize when you read a lot of books on innovation and how to set it up and how to do it, it's written by people that aren't in the midst of an ongoing business. And I think the biggest challenge about innovation is you are trying to redesign the car while you are driving it down the road in a snowstorm at night at 100 miles an hour. This is hard stuff. And so trying to take your eye off the ball of staying alive in what you're currently doing to look at how to doing something different that actually is going to disrupt yourself, that's a hard task to take on. I guess the other aspect I'd mention from experience is that those managers who are successful and move up in an organization are the ones who have been very, very good at doing the day-to-day stuff. And this sort of gets back to the old Peter Drucker quote, managers do the right things, managers do things right, leaders do the right things. There are a lot of managers who are promoted into vice president roles who do things right, but they've never had any experience, nor have they been asked to do the right things. So it's risk avoidance. You get paid to deliver what's known, not the unknown. And finally, I'd point to culture. And culture, it's the other Drucker quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The simple fact of the matter is most of the people in your business know that business very well, but they're not necessarily attuned to whatever the new business is that you're thinking of introducing. That's not their sweet spot. And so if I'm getting paid to do what I know and you're asking me to do something that I don't know, where am I going to spend my time? It's going to be on what I know. Culture can kill new business opportunities just overnight. For a number of years, I worked in a group within Lubrizol that was trying to develop new business opportunities. And great example of a disruptive innovation that Lubrizol came to had to do with automobile engine oils. Now, the current process for putting oil in your car is the engine is designed to have a oil pan that holds the oil. The oil circulates through the engine. It goes through a filter to clean out most of the impurities that build up over time. And then on a periodic basis, you change out the oil because the additive package in the oil has deteriorated. And the additive package is what Lubrizol did, was create the additives. That was what gave the performance characteristics to the oil, not the base oil, which is what the oil companies provided. Now, Lubrizol generated additive packages, and they sold them to major oil companies who put them in with their base oil and then sold finished oil through their distribution chains. What Lubrizol came up with was a way of re-additizing the base oil without taking it out of the engine. In effect, what Lubrizol came up with was a way of taking the additive package and putting it in a little gel cup. And you could take that gel cup and either insert it into the oil pan, or you could insert it into the filter. And when you changed out the filter, you were re-additizing the oil, but you didn't have to change out the base oil. Now, this would have dramatically increased Lubrizol's margin because they were selling nothing but additive, and they were selling it directly into the finished product. It was in effect cutting out the major oil companies from the engine oil value chain. Well, as you can imagine, that would have been dramatically disruptive. And in fact, Lubrizol played around with it for a few years with one of the filter manufacturers, but was never really not willing to take the risk to pull the trigger to disassociate themselves, as Christensen points out, with their major value chain, their major customers, their major volume sales, in order to try out a fundamentally new business design. Risk avoidance is something that you simply can't get away with. Okay, so this all begs the question, how can you do this? What's the right way of getting at obsolescing yourself? And I would argue that the way to do it is to pay someone to obsolesce you. What I would argue is the best approach is not necessarily creating a skunk works as a standalone group that's given the task of looking at new opportunities. I would create a skunk works where everyone in that group, they are getting paid for competing against the existing core business. In effect, you are creating your own competitor rather than allowing the external world to do it for you. And if you pick the right people and you pay the right money and you motivate them, they will do, it would be, it's surprising. I found, frankly, it was never an issue. It was never an issue of coming up with new and innovative ideas. That wasn't the challenge. The challenge was getting that innovative idea through some form of stage gate to validate it, and then scaling it to commercial size. And as soon as you got it through a stage gate to this is bona fide, this is real, this will work, and you handed it back over to a traditional business unit, they would kill it. They would put a pillow over its head at night and it was gone. So the way you need to do this is to set up a group and pay them to run you out of business. Now, what do you need to do this? Well, I would argue that group has to be very adept at pulling in the appropriate intelligence. And I've always talked about three types of intelligence: competitive intel, which is about the stakeholders in your industry; market intel, which is about what's going on within the industry. Think vehicle electrification for transport as an example. But more importantly, and often underlooked, is what I'll call strategic intel, which is the larger business environment. Think demographics. If you talk to demographics experts, one of my favorite experts is quoted as saying that demographics explains 70% of everything. And I would add my filler on that would be geography explains the other 30%. But precious few business look at demographics, that larger business environment, as to where the needs and opportunities are going. Now, I'm gonna stop for a moment, and I'm gonna simply offer up that if anybody out there is really interested in how to pull this kind of intel, the person you need to talk to is Karen Oy, the librarian at Case Western Reserve's University Kelvin Smith Library. She is a black belt grand mistress at manipulating the internet. This is an eye chart, I know, but it is an example of horizon scanning. This was one of the last things I did before I left Lubrizol. And again, I'm not asking you to read it in detail, but I'm putting this out to give you a sense of what a horizon scanning functionality would look like in terms of potential impact, in terms of likelihood of adoption, in terms of degree of disruption that are caused by a whole range of different innovative technologies that are coming at us. You have to really be scanning a very, very broad horizon if you hope to capture that disruptive innovation that's going to hit you, because as I previously said, they are coming from every single direction all of the time. Once you do that idea generation, if it's an evolutionary idea that you come back with, you can feed that back into your core business. If it's revolutionary or disruptive, then those are the sorts of things that I would create a second business to compete against your first business. And obviously, the critical issue there is building a new business unit that's got the competency to scale. If you can't scale the idea, there's so many entrepreneurs that start off at Starbucks, which is where they have their board meetings, but they get to a certain size and they can't scale. They can't get to that next level. I'm seeing that in the consulting industry. With a consulting group of which I'm familiar, where they've grown rapidly and they've reached that threshold where they can't have everybody in the same room for a quarterly meeting. And going to that next level, scaling, is what's really holding them back. So if you were asking me who is doing this well at the moment, I'd say look for companies that do have skunkworks. And in fact, I can give you one example of a company that is doing this sort of thing, Lockheed Martin. If you look up Lockheed Martin, they have a group that is set aside working on compact fusion. Now, that's not necessarily core to everything on anything on Lockheed Martin's main menu. But if they can crack the code on compact fusion, You want to talk about a disruptive technology, there it is. So with that, Phil, I think I've gotten to the end of what I have to say. I'm going to ask you to come back on and let's see if we've got any, I'd like to have some conversation with the audience.
Okay, great. Thanks, Terry. I am never going to look at a horse-drawn carriage as romantic ever again after those shots from 1894. That was a little unsettling there. So thanks for walking through this. I do have one question. I noticed at the top right of all your slides, there's this screaming woman up there. Can you explain what that is and the importance?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked. That is a painting of Cassandra, who was the priestess to Apollo in ancient Troy. And Apollo cursed her with the power of prophecy that no one would ever believe. So she foretold the Trojan horse and nobody believed her. It was a long, sad story. But the point is, I think she is the patron goddess, if you will, of strategic planners, certainly scenario planners who see the future and no one will take the time to believe them.
Yeah, I think the solution I found for that is offer up your ideas in a lunch and learn, because people will come to the meeting if you offer them free bagels. So that's how I approach it. We did have one quick question before we get into some of the meatier ones. Somebody asked again what the name of the librarian you said, who was
Karen Oy.
The ninja.
Yeah, that would be Karen Oy. Her last name is spelled O-Y-E, and she's a librarian at Kelvin Smith Library at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland.
And also looking through the question,
so be it.
Well, looking through the question, she's actually on the webinar and gave you a shout out and said hello to my good friend Terry. So a little, I'm sure she's okay with the shout out. So.
Well, if she's not, she can't reach me anyway, so I'm safe.
All right, so I've got a question I just want to start with. You gave us an example about 3D printing. And I remember a talk you gave a while back where you talked about dimensionalizing the impact of 3D printing, and you used movies as an example of how to make that impact sticky. And you would characterize 3D printing, it could either become like Toy Story, where it's just good for trinkets. It could become failure to launch, which means it's a great, interesting technology, sits on the shelf, never gets used for anything. Or it could be limitless, which means it could be used for all things great and small. 5 or so years on from that talk, where would you place that today, just out of curiosity?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, that was the outcome of a scenario planning exercise that we did at Lubrizol, and I used a class at Baldwin-Wallace University in their business school. Students, it was a full year class, and they took the fall and looked at 3D printing, and then they took the spring and they looked at Lubrizol and tried to understand and report back to senior management at Lubrizol what the implications of 3D printing were for the company. And it's interesting to watch the progression of 3D printing, because there were so many people at the front end who said, well, this will never take off because it's not fast enough. You can't produce at a certain rate. I can't get the right performance attributes out of the materials that are available. And there's just a whole long litany of reasons why this will never take off. Well, lo and behold, when you look at how the 3D printing industry has shaken out, and you look at the new materials that have come in, and you look at the 3D printing is really not one technology. It's actually about a dozen different ways of doing it. But they can print with metal, they can print with plastic, they can print food, they can print skin. I mean, they literally, you think of the Star Trek replicator, we're getting really close to the Star Trek replicator. And what I've found fascinating is when you think about all of a sudden the big push underway to with Musk and the others building their own rocket ships that we're going to go to the moon and then we're going to go to Mars. This is obviously a lot more time and treasure has been spent on that recently than we've seen in the past, well, since the 60s. What's interesting is you go to the NASA site and how are they looking at building facilities on the moon or on Mars? It's with 3D printing. So 3D printing has gotten to the point where I can make stuff at the nano level and I can build buildings with it. They've 3D printed automobiles. And again, the performance characteristics and the materials that are being used are dramatically increasing day to day to day to day. So I'm hedging my bets a little bit, but I'd say we are pretty close to limitless.
Okay. So with that, it's sometimes difficult when you're in the middle of the disruption cycle, like perhaps we are with 3D printing. How do you know when it's hit a tipping point and it's time to take your chips off one pile and put your chips in a different pile?
Well, and I guess that goes back to my suggestion, which is why you pay somebody to obsolesce you rather than having somebody else do it for you. When you're in a position where as a CEO or a VP and you can look at your core business and how it's performing, and you can look at your competitive business that you've created that's working at it, you're in a much better position to then assess the comparative market values of the two. I go back to Lubrizol, and there was a particular material that was used for piping material. Okay, they could make pipe out of it. And when it was first introduced, it was at the top of the Slywatsky value curve. It was unique, high value, higher cost, but it occupied the playing field. And so they were fat and sassy with that. And then as it started sliding down the Slywatsky value curve where competition started coming in, you spent your time rather than on innovating, you spent it on taking cost out so that you could continue to compete. But when you got down to the bottom, you were selling a commodity. And that's where they had gotten to, but they were still thinking about it as though it was a high value, high margin product. And they had never gotten to that point where they could pull the plug. They just couldn't walk away. And what I was trying to convince them to do was, let's look at all of the different other opportunities that we have for this particular material. Let's take a look at all of its performance characteristics. Let's now start doing that horizon scanning. Let's find those other opportunities for that material and reapply it. And then we're in a position, because we're doing both, we're on both sides of the equation, as to when we scale back that old core, now commodity business towards our newer business and walk away from it. But if you don't do it yourself, somebody will do it for you.
So do you think companies that don't do it themselves, do you feel like that's a failure of imagination? Or do you think you can set up a process to get around failure of imagination?
Well, my experience, you had said, you get people to listen to you by giving them bagels. My experience maybe is a little more cynical. I think it's a case of credibility is in the eye of the beholder. And if you don't have the right CEO or you don't have the right VP who has the capacity to see the future, who is looking at strategic intelligence, because that's their job. They should be looking at the value proposition beyond the current value proposition, as opposed to how do I tinker with getting another couple pennies out of my per unit cost. I just don't think most businesses, when they promote, it's almost the Peter principle. I'm going to take somebody who's really good at doing yesterday's work and I'm going to promote them into a position where they should be doing tomorrow's work. And they don't have the skill set. They don't have the, I wouldn't even say it's imagination. It's just vision, risk tolerance. They're just not the right people for the job, but they've been promoted into it. And that's the way business is designed. It's designed to run on what you're currently doing, not what you need to do in the future. Anyway, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. We did get another question where somebody wanted to read more about 3 types of innovation: the evolutionary, revolutionary, and disruptive. Aside from the Innovator's Dilemma, what would you recommend for reading there?
Well, I think you need to understand where your business is and understand the implications of the different forms of innovation. Evolutionary innovation has been and will be an ongoing thing. Every company innovates all of the time. They're always tinkering. So you're knocking the quarters off, you're taking out a couple pennies, you're changing the molding on the refrigerator door. You're always doing those incremental improvements that may incrementally add value or may incrementally reduce cost. When you get to revolutionary and disruptive, though, you're talking about something that's going to, think of the difference between plate tectonics, where things move very slowly and you can adjust, versus an earthquake, which is overnight. It's a discontinuity. Okay. And I think revolutionary and disruptive innovation are more in the realm of discontinuous change to a value proposition or a marketplace. Think of, well, for example, clothes, tailoring. Long years ago, I would go get my suits at J Press in New York City on 47th Street, wherever they were located. And they were not bespoke, but they were very well-made suits that they would then tailor to fit me. And I've got really long arms, so I've always got problems getting clothes. Well, today there is an app out there where I can put it on my phone, and I can put my phone on the floor and turn on the camera in the app. And if I stand there and I circle around like this, it measures me. And then I can go on to their website, and they'll have 3 dozen, 4 dozen different suit styles. And I can pick out the suit style and the fabric that I want. And they will make me a bespoke suit that fits better than that J Press store-bought suit, and ship it to my house. And I've never left the house. That is a revolutionary change to tailoring in terms of not only the offerings to the customer, but the ease and convenience to the customer, especially now when I can't get out of my house. But although I don't need to wear suits, I'm actually wearing shorts under this. But but the point being, understanding the type of disruption that you're looking at or that you want to achieve. I go back to the horse and buggy. No one who was in the horse and buggy industry was necessarily thinking about, geez, what are we going to do about manure? I mean, they were talking about, how do I make a better buggy, or how do I breed a different kind of horse? And I don't think anybody necessarily connected those dots. It was one of those strategic intelligence type questions or issues that all of a sudden changed the landscape. There's this wonderful canard about Henry Ford, who allegedly said if customers had asked me what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Well, he never did say that. But the point is, that's not what drove this. It was something that was totally exogenous to the performance of the horse and the buggy. And so you've got to be able to see that bigger picture beyond just what's going on with your competitors and what's on within the technologies in your market to what's moving the markets. And that's where I think is the big blind spot. People don't see what's moving them. The demographics, when you look at long-term demographics, a couple books. That's a good one. When you listen to anybody nowadays talk about demographics, what they say is, oh, well, the world's population is going to continue to grow, 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 grow. You know, by the end of the century, we'll be, you know, cheek by jowl. Well, if you look at the United Nations and then you look at some of the demographics experts who are critiquing the United Nations, what they're saying is, you know, the dramatic increase in urbanization around the world, especially in the developing world, where for the first time ever we have more people living in cities than in the country, is having a dramatic impact on birth rates. And in fact, half of the countries of the world are no longer reproducing their populations. Now, stop and think about the implications of a world where you get at some point to a maximum population and then it starts declining, because you're starting to see demographic pyramids that are inverted.
Right.
That then goes back to that chart I showed earlier. I'll back up to it. I hope. We live now in a world, or have lived in a world, where demand exceeded supply. We are going to a world where supply will exceed demand. That's driven by demographics, that's driven by urbanization. Long-term trend, but the numbers don't lie. If you aren't thinking about what that 2000 plus world is going to look like now, and you're still thinking 1955 in terms of how you're producing, good luck with that. It isn't going to work. Another great, you know, while I'm throwing books around, here's another one, The Accidental Superpower by Peter Zeihan, on what's going to happen with the world economy. Another strategic intelligence global long-term issue is the United States basically pulling back from Pax Americana, no longer wanting to be the world's global policeman on international trade, not willing to subsidize the global marketplace. Now, you can agree or disagree with what Zeihan says or the rate at which it's changing, but it's pretty obvious when you just look at the macro trends that the global marketplace is changing. And one of the possible future scenarios is many regional balkanized markets. So that begs the question, what does that mean if I'm a global mass producer? How do I live in that world? If you're not thinking about those questions as a vice president or a CEO, you're not doing your job.
Right. So I want to go back to something you just mentioned, talking about market forces and how the economy has a lot to say here. A question we got from our friend Jim Miller, who's in Ottawa, is about government regulations and the role of government in the mix. So you talked during the washing machine example about tweaking energy standards to your advantage. Is it always an outside force? Is it something you can use to your advantage? What would you say?
Well, that's riding the tiger. Okay. The thing about government interference, anytime the government regulates, they are by definition, just, you know, classics Econ 101, they are distorting the market. Okay. So I'll give you another example from the Department of Energy. When they first set out their proposed standard for energy efficiency with ovens. Now, the first proposal that DOE gave out was because they had taken an oven and they had analyzed it, and they decided that the greatest heat loss from an oven was from the window in the door. So what they were going to propose was a design standard where they were going to require ovens not to have a window in the door, which immediately tells you that the person who wrote that had never used an oven. Because the first time you open that oven to see what's going on, you take all that heat and you've lost it, and then you start all over again. So government regulation, I think, you know, this goes back to the whole issue of legislative authority abdicating their power to technocrats after the Second World War, where we now have all of these regulatory agencies that are filled with technocrats that are not answerable to the electorate, which is why you are seeing what you are seeing with Brexit and with Mr. Trump being elected. There's a lot of political upheaval at the moment because the system doesn't work anymore in a complex world. So getting back to the question, is regulation a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I don't think any one company is going to be able to start it or stop it. So the question is, you have to pick your fights and see when you can take advantage of them. Certainly Frigidaire did when it came to Whirlpool. And you look at the market now, and it's what percentage of it is front loaders? You go into Lowe's or Home Depot or any of those places, right. They're all over the place. So you can ride that tiger, but I would just assume the government allow the market to figure out where it's going, because the future is going to be a hell of a lot more complex than even what it is now. Witness all of the technology changes I mentioned.
Okay, so regulation is a lot like nuclear energy. It can be good, it can be bad, but you don't want to stand too close to it.
Something like that, yeah. One other book, let me quick mention. Another appalling thing about regulation is you would think that our regulators, that our policy people at the top, would be the best informed. Well, those of you who remember Hans Rosling, just before he passed away, he and his son and daughter-in-law, they put out a book called Factfulness. And the point that Rosling makes in this book is that he went to Davos, and he tested them as well as hundreds and hundreds of other people in terms of their basic knowledge about the state of the world today. And what he discovered is that most of these people, their perception of what the world looked like now was really based on what they saw when they were growing up in the 60s and the 70s. And that fundamental information about health, wealth, urbanization, child health, you name it. They didn't know what the right data was. They didn't know what was going on. And so if these are the people that are writing the regulations and they don't understand the actual state of the world, more distortion.
All right. We have time for one final question. Came from our audience, and this one is really well suited for you, being a very well-studied individual, depth of experience, and also being a professor. How do you think the institutions of higher learning should be looking forward at disruption, and how should we teach it?
Well, it's interesting. A number of years ago, we did scenario planning at CASE around the future of education. And if you think about where that future may go, there are two axes. The one is, what are you selling? And the other is, how are you selling? And what are you selling? Are you selling a degree, which is a prefabricated set of skills? Think of it as a necklace. Or are you selling individual skill sets? Think of it as beads. And then how you sell it is, do you have butts and seats in a campus, or are you doing it online? So the one extreme is what we've always done, which is I'm giving you a degree and you're in a classroom. The other extreme is I am selling you a discrete skill online. So I might, as a student, get one skill from the University of New Hampshire. I might get another skill from Tokyo University. I might get another skill from Ohio State University, because each of them is the best in that particular skill set. Then you've got all the permutations in between. So I don't have an answer. I mean, this is obviously with the programs that are being offered at the present time, and trying to get graduate students or business people to come back to school. This is a critical issue. And of course, what we're going through at the moment with the coronavirus is really forcing people to play around with some of these options that heretofore they would not have considered. But when you think of the cost of traditional education, it's the old saw, if something can't continue, it won't. And so the existing design of academic institutions simply cannot continue. The economics aren't there for it. So unless you've got the thinkers who are thinking about that future as opposed to how do I get more butts in my seat today, good luck with them.
Right. No, that's a great great topic that is very timely, as you mentioned. It's definitely something that is going to be more long-term thinking for not only education but business as well. Is how do you deal with butts not being in seats and people being remote? So Terry, I want to thank you for this talk. It was great. We're going to close out the webinar. Hopefully you will stay in touch and be able to make these slides available for individuals afterwards, along with some of the titles of the books and the authors that you had shown us during the presentation. That would be wonderful. And
certainly, if anybody has any follow-on questions and they want to track me down, I'm happy to converse.
Okay, awesome. If you could zip us up to the last slide, we'll go ahead and close out today's session. Once again, we'd like to thank the audience who has been part of the webinar today. And as we mentioned at the beginning, one of you will be selected for a $25 gift card. So thank you for your participation and your attendance. The recording of this presentation will be placed on the SLA CIC's YouTube channel. So take a look at that and watch all of SLA and the competitive intelligence community's social media posts for information. As we said at the beginning, there is other continuing education topics available. Go to sla.org and click the Learn tab. And also, we will have another SLA CIC webinar in May. Topic and presenter is being put together as we speak. So again, watch social media and look for that update. With that, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank you, Terry, and have a great day.
Thanks, Bill. Cheers.
Thank you.